Bonjour à toutes et tous. Merci énormément d'être là au sein de la délégation Wallonie-Bruxelles. Je me présente, je suis Stéphanie Pécourt, la directrice du centre Wallonie-Bruxelles. Dans la constellation d'opérateurs Wallonie-Bruxelles, je suis donc la directrice du centre qui se trouve face à Beaubourg, qui est fermé pour le moment pour rénovation, d'où cette présence providentielle et vraiment précieuse au sein de la délégation. Je tiens à remercier plus que chaleureusement notre délégué, Marc Lerbois. Remercier également l'ISEA de la proposition qui nous a été faite d'être partenaire de ce colloque. Ça s'inscrivait dans une collaboration qu'on avait d'ores et déjà engagée avec Carrie notamment, avec Ewen. Donc vraiment un grand plaisir d'être partenaire. Vous découvrirez notamment le travail de deux artistes avec lesquels on a travaillé ces dernières saisons, Alice Palot et également Anne-Marie Masse, parmi les projets qui vous seront présentés aujourd'hui. Je ne serai pas plus longue, vous n'êtes pas venu m'écouter, et je céderai d'emblée la parole à notre délégué général. Merci beaucoup et bon après-midi, bon symposium.
Merci Stéphanie. J'ai préparé un petit mot, mais je crois que je vais parler comme ça, quelques mots de bienvenue. I give this message in French. I'm sorry I haven't got it in English. I could say a few words in English, but I will tell it in French. Je vous souhaite à toutes et à tous, bien entendu, la plus cordiale bienvenue ici à la délégation générale Wallonie-Bruxelles. Un petit mot peut-être pour que celles et ceux qui ne sont pas encore venus ici ou qui viennent pour la première fois sachent où vous êtes. Donc vous vous retrouvez dans la représentation Wallonie-Bruxelles. Donc nous faisons partie intégrante de la mission diplomatique belge ici à Paris. Et notre délégation générale est la représentation diplomatique de deux gouvernements francophones belges, la Fédération Wallonie-Bruxelles et la région wallonne. Ça nous amène ici en France et ici à Paris à développer des activités au niveau bilatéral, évidemment, avec notre pays hôte, la France, des activités qui concernent les régions et les communautés en Belgique, mais qui sont très nombreuses, qui vont de la culture, de la langue, de l'éducation, de l'enseignement, et j'en passe au niveau de la Fédération Wallonie-Bruxelles, mais aussi des matières essentielles comme le secteur économique, la promotion des exportations, l'attraction des investissements, etc. Donc c'est tout cela que nous réalisons au niveau bilatéral. Et au niveau multilatéral, nous sommes ici à Paris avec d'importantes organisations internationales qui concernent nos compétences, notamment une qui a trait à la langue française, l'Organisation internationale de la l'Organisation internationale de la francophonie. Enfin, le lapsus était positif finalement. Langue française et francophonie, ça va bien ensemble. L'UNESCO et également l'OCDE. Donc voilà un peu un aperçu de nos activités. Alors on a évidemment tout de suite accepté, je dirais, l'opportunité qui nous a été donnée par Stéphanie, par la directrice du centre Wallonie-Bruxelles. Alors évidemment, vous auriez encore été beaucoup mieux accueillis et vous le serez encore beaucoup mieux dans les tout nouveaux locaux du centre Wallonie-Bruxelles. Mais voilà, vous êtes quand même dans un coin de Belgique ici pour votre événement. J'ai lu le descriptif de l'événement et bien entendu, c'est sur un sujet qui nous parle tous et qui nous interpelle tous, avec une approche, je crois, assez originale de rassembler à la fois des chercheurs et aussi des créateurs. Donc je trouve ça vraiment très, très excitant et très enivrant. Voilà, je vous souhaite à toutes et à tous la bienvenue, un bon colloque et je te cède la parole, Stéphanie, et je te souhaite aussi plein succès pour cette activité. Voilà.
Merci.
Hello everybody. So I would like to thank you for joining us. It's really nice to be here, and I want to thank, of course, the delegation and Marc Clerbois, but also Henrietta Obia, and Stéphanie Pécourt and Sarah Neda, and of course all the team. Damien, Pages. And of course, we also partner with a Swiss Cultural Center So I would like to thank Jean-Marc Diebold and Claire Hoffman for that, and of course all the team and Pro Helvetia for supporting us, Ariane Riebstein in particular, and the Embassy of Switzerland, Lila Gita and Maya Minder, who is here also and speaking in the first speakers. More Than Planet is part of cooperation Creative Europe. It's embedded in ISEA program as a side event, and it's coordinated by Miha Tursic from VAR Future Lab from Amsterdam. Miha will give a few words afterwards in partnership with Project Atoll from Slovenia. We also have a representative who will talk tomorrow, and as well as Leonardo Olatz, who you may have seen a podcast room with Leonardo from Paris, and Photo North, the Northern Photographic Center from Finland, and do I forget, Ars Electronica, of course, as a partner. We will have an exhibition, More Than Planet, in September, and More Than Planet in Ars Electronica, and very much looking forward. Of course, I want to thank, and of course, I want to thank the R2M team. So I represent R2M company. We run a magazine, notably known Makery.info. So I want to thank Karine Le Mallet, co-curator with me. And maybe you want to say a word, actually, or thank some people?
Just I would be really grateful if you can shut your phone during the presentation, and just that's all. Enjoy the presentation, because we have a really, really nice program. So I prefer to let time for all the people who will talk.
Yes, we will try to stay on time, because we would really like to open the floor for discussions at the end, a really long one. So I also ask the speakers who are now going to talk to kind of stick on time. I would like to still mention the team of R2M. So I said Karine, Benjamin Gollon, Elsa Ferreira, Rob Lafrenet, who else? Elisa Chavenot, Julie Vérin. I'm worried forgetting people, but too many people. But we are really happy to put all this together. So very much welcome. And now I will leave the floor to Mia Tursic and Rob Lafrenet, who will, you can come on stage, and Miha will give a bit of description of the More Than Planet program, which is, as I said, Creative Europe running from 2022 to 2025. Rob Lafrenet here is a former member of the ISEA board, a well-known curator. We've been collaborating a lot together in the past, and still now we do. So Rob will moderate this first session today. Tomorrow there will be another session moderated by Pauline Briand. She couldn't make it today. But yeah, I leave you the floor, guys. And if you want to connect to the screen, okay. It's here. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'll introduce Mia, and just to say it's a wonderful coming together of lots of old friends and faces. But more importantly, what they forgot to mention is that the toilets are there. Mia.
Thanks. I would really like to be precise, so I will take my text. Yeah, so also from my side, great thanks to organizers and our hosts, especially because this project, the More Than Planet, started at, let's say, 3 years ago here in Paris, at, let's say, opportunity like this one, sitting with Annick from Leonardo, she's there, and Uroš Weber from Atoll. Yes, with beers and crazy ideas, like let's work on our legacies of art science, art and humanities in outer space, and space culturalization. So that's all these our backgrounds, and we really wanted to kind of move forward with it. And all the partners that Ewan mentioned are amazing partners. I'm really having a privilege working in these collaborations. And also there was no better task for us than thinking of, let's say, today's environmental troubles. So from the space arts, we kind of address problems of the planet. What are planets? What's the environment? How to think about these questions. And especially in this European context, the question of the environment, of the planet was emerging, and we kind of formed our efforts in rethinking the way we build what we call the concept of planetarity. And also because it's usually taken for granted that we understand what it is, yet what we are learning, especially throughout the project, is that it's quite contested ground of knowledge making. And we took this effort quite responsibly, I think, aware especially of our vulnerabilities in relation of this quite continuous growth of what we call a vast machine of interests. So environment is quite pressed by all these interests, states, industry, and so on. And we are not shy that our main discursive tool in this context are our concerns. Quite fragile freedom of being able to express these concerns. And what we build on is a kind of a understanding that the whole Earth environment is made, so it's not there since ever. We don't take it for granted. And who makes this environment and our planet, for us it matters. We also built on understanding that, I mean, at least personally, I learned that within the project, that people inhabit this planet, I mean, most of the planet, like more than 80–90% from the last age on, last ice age on, so for like 12,000 years, most of the planet is inhabited and under human impact. Yet the balance was tipped only in the last 200 years. What we understand is that the way we imagine environment makes an impact on how we make these environments as well. So we're kind of focusing on what we call a crisis of planetary imaginary, so the way we imagine the planet. This is quite a contested ground for us. So what we're trying to do, we're trying to articulate in quite general terms, working on societal awareness of these environmental urgencies, trying to work on new environmental narratives, especially in the public context, so for not in the context of these private interests or state interests, but in public spaces, and also what we call critical zones. So there are some spaces that require more urgency maybe than others. What we're working on is also so-called cultural environmental literacy, so trying to contribute to the general understanding of the environment in relation to technologies that we use. We will have one presentation tomorrow on this topic, kind of a building what we call a planetary stack. So what's needed to construct an understanding of the planet. Further than that, developing more collaborative art innovation practices. So not just supporting individual artists, more transdisciplinary collaborations with scientists, with engineers, with regulators, how to construct all these kind of understandings and how to address environmental troubles. And as the underlying layer, working on what we call European Cultural Outer Space Activities Framework. So literally more systemic understanding how to organize ourselves to address these planetary understandings. Since at this moment they're still quite dominated by techno-scientific institutions like space agencies, like only academia, and there's not enough, let's say, artistic and cultural efforts that will be systemically part of the efforts. And this opportunity here, thank you, Makery, for organizing this session here, is going to be a nice opportunity to get your inputs, your perspectives, your views, and that can be discussed in a way that we can build on top of that. Thank you.
Yeah. That you made some very pertinent points, which I hope we'll be returning to throughout the discussions today. I just want to point out that we're going to try and keep it dynamic and informal as possible, and encourage inputs from you, the audience, as much as we can. In order to do that, we've made the decision that there will just be, in the first and the second sections, short questions, urgent questions at the end of each speaker, and a proper discussion at the end. I should also point out that I'm not going to read the bios. You can see the bios in the More Than Planet, on the More Than Planet website with the PDF, and just look at the bios. I'm going to try and give a more informal introduction to each person based on some discussions we had today. So we're running just about on time. We're about to start at 2:30. I'm going to be a very, very strict timekeeper. I'll give you all 15 minutes notice, and we'll cut you off completely at the end of the 30 minutes. Okay, so I'd really like to introduce Gabriel up to the stage. So Gabriel G is the co-founder of the TETI Group, which is based all around Europe, but he's based in Switzerland. His particular line is looking at industrial heritage and port cities and how they relate to natural environments. He's also going to be showing some work by some artists who I'm kind of quite familiar with. Charles Lim, Maria Teresa Alves, and others. I've worked with both of them. And he's talking specifically about, I think, the port cities and the networks which emerge from port cities. And it's very significant that we actually met online as part of something called the Soil Assembly, as part of the Kochi Biennale, co-organized by Srishti Institute in Bangalore, Makery, University of Westminster, Hacteria, and I think some other organizations. And we were both part of this Soil Assembly, which was, the resonances are going on as we speak, and various soil assemblies are being planned around the world. So, Gabriel, can you take us off with your paper, which is called Living Marines? Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Bonjour à tous. Je suis ravi d'être parmi vous. Merci pour l'invitation, Yuen, Karine. And I will switch to English. And is that this is the darkest possible that we can get? Ça va pour la lumière, c'est très clair. Mais... So yeah, just briefly, my name's Gabriel G, and I'm part of TETI. Just a word about TETI, Textures and Experience of Transindustriality. We're a group with an interdisciplinary interest, so doing publications, workshops, encounters, and also culinary narratives. Well, so I'll try and say a few words that end with that a little bit, perhaps. So, but yes, this talk entitled Living Marines, taking the marine as a genre which emerged, a pictorial genre which emerged in Europe in the early modern age. That's the Jan Porcellus that you have here. When painters turned their eyes to the sea, to ships, coast, and harbor scenes, while maritime commercial networks extended their reach across the oceans. In the 20th century, the standardization of containers in maritime transportation induced a distancing between ever-modernizing globalized societies and the seas. On the other hand, environmental pressure and critical perspectives on global entanglements that were just being mentioned here in the introduction have prompted renewed attention in the late 20th and early 20th century to maritime worlds, human and non-human. In the visual arts, hybrid forms and narratives emerge with the capacity to interrogate and reinvent the traditional canon of the marine. So as part of the discussions within the More Than Planet Ocean Space Ocean Symposium, This presentation will try to discuss more specifically some art practices that engage in diverse media and forms with oceanic presence and inhabitants, leading to a revitalizing, potentially, of the seascapes in analytical, critical, and poetic proposals for the present and future, to be understood as living marines. However, I will actually start by looking very much at the negative space of the living marine, cette surface solide, je cite, cette surface solide, plane et étendue où se déplacent des supertankers brûlants de pétrole pour transporter du pétrole, to quote from the organizers' opening text. These oceanic motorways that bind the world together and whose invisible agency operates silently in the decisive metabolic transformations of our interconnected societies. Then second, I will look at a set of contemporary practices that offer alternate positive modes of being at sea, articulating a set of living marines of being with the ocean and the seas and its myriad of entities in a form of enhanced planetary understanding. Through three sets of perspective: one, a living cartography in the work of the Map Office; two, an embodied being at sea in the series Sea State by Charles Lim; and three, a microscalar rumination in Laurie de Lava's Archives Sauvées des Eaux, leading possibly to a renewed invitation to hearing the non-human voices that roam the planet's ocean. So first, few words about these oceanic motorways as seen through the lenses of a couple of artist perspectives. The short film Supercargo from 2010 by Christoph Schwarz, an artist, the artist, I think, based in Germany, is to have an exhibition in Shanghai and decides for ecological reasons not to take a plane to get there, but rather a ship. A cheap way for him to travel is to take a position as a cleaner on board a supercargo, departing from Hamburg to Shanghai. And in the opening shots, he is seen entering a corridor in the belly of the ship with his backpack and a guitar in hand, making his way up to the control room, where he takes a seat in a room that is basically empty. For it turns out there's nobody else but him on this ship, which is being navigated in the story semi-automatically. For insurance reasons, the company needed to have at least one person on board, and that's him. And at the start, he takes the job very seriously. So the job is like Reinigung, so to clean the place. So he sort of goes with his little brush in the deep of the belly, But after a while, it gets a bit tiring. The ships move south, the temperature rise. His initial commitments start to wane. In the Red Sea, he becomes worried about pirates and makes anxious radio calls to the operating personnel in Dublin, I think it was. And he also, at that point, realizes that the stack of containers on the cargo ship are empty, further eroding the meaningfulness that is being explained in the narrative of his role in the great wheel of the global economy. And after 2 weeks alone in the Indian Ocean, he starts to lose his head, giving names to the containers, establishing a personal relation with Eugene, Maddie, Leopold, containers. He abandons his cleaning duties, visits his container friends regularly, singing ballads to entertain them, and then eventually moving into a container. And when the ship arrives in Hong Kong, he has lost consciousness, and he's transported back to his cabin by the port crew, which is the slide here that you have. In Shanghai, you can have a look at this film on his website. He's back on his feet, and the final shots are a performance he does with a Vietnamese artist in a gallery, in which the two open fruits by cracking their shells on each other's head.
Can I just interrupt, Gabriel? He really did that?
Well, yes, it was filmed on the ship. Yes, absolutely. Yes.
But it's a kind of a fiction.
Yes, it's a fiction. Yes.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Yeah. Christopher Schwarz depicts, I think, a ghost ship, I would say, where in a disconnected world economic in a disconnected world, economics proceed mechanically by their own internal combustion into a meaningless void, and the last remaining human loses his head. And I'll just make, it's a short paradox. It's interesting to note that although it's a completely different style, but it was made in the same year as Forgotten Space by Noel Birch and Alan Sekula, of celebrated fame and interest, and would have similar points to make. But I pass on. The emergence of the marine painting in the Dutch artistic tradition coincided historically with the opening of long-distance oceanic route, a point underlined by Margaretha Russell in her study of the works of Hendrik Cornelis Vroom, the so-called father of marine painting, active in the late 16th and early 17th century, whose first seascapes, such as the return of the Second Dutch Expedition to Amsterdam, were in effect historical and political paintings. A little down the road, Mario Vegetti, in a rereading of the political analysis of Carl Schmitt, analyzed the shift taking place in transportation at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, underlined in form of newfound liquidity, and I quote, at the source of the Western technico-industrial development, there is an image of the world, and it is only through this vision of an inland as a pure coast, as a mere point of anchorage in a deterritorialized empire made of line of communications and ports, diffused in a fragmentary manner on all continents, that the period of free global commerce explodes, end of quote. The sea becomes a pure surface, yet a surface that reflects commercial and political might. I think the weather's kind of turning cloudy, so you can see better this painting by John Brett, Britannia's Realm, which reflects the in the Victorian era, Britain's imperial maritime domination, in which a tranquil sea of the Welsh coast, we can see only a couple of sailing boats idly enjoy the breeze, but is in effect meant to represent this imperial roots and connections. However, the oceanic motorways should not hide the parallel vertical explorations that technical advances of the 19th century facilitated in unprecedented fashion. Per the classic Jules Verne here to capture this rising scrutiny, as well of the attention to modern technological forays, and perhaps, of course, the Voyage au centre de la Terre would be its equivalent in land-based. In the short film Drill Ship Walkthrough, the artist David Jack, a Liverpool-based artist, takes us on board the Kuluk, a shell drilling platform that we use for oil extraction in the Arctic seas, and which, in the wake of the catastrophic 2010 Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, drifted aground in 2011. Here too, in this film, it's about 11 minutes, we are visiting a ghost ship, led, however, by a radio operator, with the threatening surge of the Arctic seas rising into the habitat. And I'll just show a brief extract of David Jack's film towards the end of it.
Hydrocarbonholic, petrocollapse, dethanol, volcano, burnicane, the live feed. No side boys, no watchstanders, no bosun's mates. Thursday, south wind 30 knots, seas building to 21 feet. The doom plume, the top kill, the boom sludge, Franken-juice, the payoff. The Sarah Palin, oil apocalypse, Chevrolet, oil Mageddon, hellhole, the 710, devil's excrement, the Tony Hayward, fire cane, the Oglups billionaire, you got Texaco, the BP moment, Inferno Cane, you got Exxon, Spillonomics, the Gigadeath, the Crudocane, hydrocarbonholic, petro collapse, dethanol, volcano, burnicane, live feed, global harming.
As in, about halfway, so perfect. As in his previous land-based short film, Oil is the Devil Excrement, based on a quote by Carlos André Pérez, a former president of Venezuela, the extractive controlling process turns against humans in a shipwreck that with Steve Mance we can see as a product of the wet globalization brought about by unprecedented maritime entanglements of the 16th century. And ocean studies and the blue humanities demand, I suppose, that we not only reflect but act on the pressing spiral that is turning the planet into a dumping ground. That's the platform that it actually features. I'll pass this on. I did have an interlude, but it's a bit tentative, so I won't go too much in it with this Minoan ceramics. I was just interested in thinking about the marine more generally. I'll just say it in a few sentences. In the thoughts that came from in the Dawn of Everything by David Graeber and David Wengrow, in which, to summarize a long book in a few words, they articulate an argument against a sort of impervious necessity of modern technology trajectory, a form of theological modernism, by looking through new archaeological and anthropological information and sources at the pluralities of possibilities that existed in past cultures, past civilizations. The Minoan are one of the examples that I mentioned, and the one that is more sea-based, let's say, from all the examples that they use as a form of woman-led, pacific type of organization. So maybe this, and to me, that also suggests ways of rereading maybe this Dutch marine, but I won't go too much into it, so that I have time to show you a couple of these three examples of possible living marines. For humans, if the sea and the oceans have long held a joint terror and fascination, to refer to the publication and exhibition organized by Alain Corbin and Hélène Richard, yet in the age of measure and the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century, it draws a curtain on this, has drawn a curtain on this ancient relation. And as the theme of the symposium suggests, can we retrieve in instructive manner this attention that it once held? So attention to oceanic entities and ecologies have grown significantly in the art world in the past decade, with projects, just to name a few, such as the TBA 20 Academy, that Bob was just mentioning to me as well, and exhibitions such as the Oceanic at the NTU Center for Contemporary Art in Singapore in 2018. Titi has an ongoing research project named Hybrid Marines, which we launched at the Association of Art Historians in Newcastle, Birmingham in 2021, which looked amongst other at vivified seascapes. And just this invitation was kind of I see it as, as a pull to try and think, for me, and here still in tentative fashion, to think further into an aspect of this hybrid seascapes as living marines. The first example goes back to cartography and by a project by Map Office, which takes the South China Sea as a monument. The conflicted state of the South China Sea has similarly been explored by this project in a collection of maps and drawings, exploring the complex and dangerous currents threatening the ecosystems of a region strategically located between competing global interests, which are very much in the news these days as well. The project offers a mapping of the sea and its multiple archipelagos, islands, and reefs, which is posited as an attempt to reclaim, quote, the sea for the common good and for the present and future generations, end of quote. British and French intrusion in the 18th and 19th century into the trail of the maritime Silk Roads, followed by Japanese colonial ambitions, have now mutated in an intercrossing of legal claims from the Philippines, Malaysia, Vietnam, Taiwan, and China. And such claims are supported by military appropriations and infrastructure in the wider context of opposing ideological views from Beijing and Washington. In addition to the conflicts inherited from European colonial expansion, environmental pressure is further fueled by overfishing. And maybe I will just, again, this is from the article that they published in eFlux, which has a number of text, but also a number of interesting visuals. That gives you a little bit more of an insight here into the whole project, which opposes such national encroachments, promoting the microhistories these spaces harbor, delicate socio-nature that have been shaped by centuries of national and human inflection, suddenly threatened by bulldozers of political and economic hubris. And the maps make visible a polyphony of voices that are at risk of being silenced, erased. And in a further disruption of traditional monumental representation, maps of the South China Sea as monument shifts the attention from historical figures to geographical ecosystems, from national mouthpieces to the plurality of voices, human and non-human, inhabiting the maritime South China Sea. My second example is that of the work of Charles Lim. He's an ongoing, very interesting body of work called Sea State. It's spanning over a number of years. This project developed an inquiry into the maritime space and history of Singapore, geographically positioned at the strategic passage between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea, and historically hybridized between its Malay roots, British and European colonial legacies, and the harbor's cosmopolitan métissage that has seen Arab, Indian, and Chinese populations, amongst others, settle in the city. The series is structured in meteorological parts in which conditions of the sea, indexed on the World Meteorological Code of the Seas, are labeled from calm to violent, and these wet meditations are best found in the sea itself. For Lim, who is originally a professional sports sailor, the sea is seen as an ally, as a safe place in which to reside, rather than a dangerous, life-threatening entity. The ship of the pictorial marine is no longer merely depicted, but boarded on and navigated, as in the slide here that you have, this is Sea State 6, and the sea is perceived not solely from the upper deck and the open air, but from below as the boat capsizes repeatedly, and we found ourselves with the camera in between air and water. So this opens up a journey into the underbelly of the sea state, as additional footage also takes us into the caverns under Singapore. So just briefly, just not to be too long, sea state has both, an attention to a reconnection to the sea as a milieu, as a space of living. And also there's a part which is about the corporate Singapore, about the sand mining, that this whole story is that. So they're kind of intertwined, those two aspects, just to say briefly. The other examples here that I checked, but it's a really kind of long and very interesting work is that of this drift rope, it seems to me like a sort of slightly Duchampian variation embodied, where this rope is left, and at the beginning it's like this étalon norm, and it's straight, but then starts drifting, starts being lost at sea, starts being governed by the elements. So yeah. And my third example goes more towards the micro marine. As seen here through the work of Laurie Dallava, a French artist who operates at the crossroads of several scalar dimensions and across different territories, land-based and marine-based. Of particular importance is the use in her work of the archive, an archive of extended imagery and textual references, nominal references rather, as in De Soufre et d'Azote, which features a list of volcanoes brought into dialogue with the meditating figure of a shaman. In Symbiosis, which you have here on the screen, a series on your left-hand side, a series of botanic plates of microalgae serves as a starting point to explore the ramification and potential of molecular networks. Again, one that is also put in parallel with the network of mycelium that extends beneath trees and their roots. This work is part of a larger body of documentation anesthésie, whose very organization mirrors such non-hierarchical mode of organization in an archipelagic fashion referring to the work of Édouard Glissant. The poetic turns to the microscalar level, finds an iconic visual presence in Aphanizomenon, in which the abstraction of texture is that of primordial life. This is on the right-hand side, and I quote Laurie Dalava on this work. Difficult to say precisely what it is. A straw field, a blaze. There are in fact cyanobacteria on the surface of a lake which seems to oscillate. I find this almost invisible movement of the living interesting as it recalls a sort of primitive soup. End of quote. Cyanobacteria as microorganisms that use sunlight to make their own food point to an early phase in the life cycle, but also a model of substance of which we will hear more from different artistic and scientific perspectives later this afternoon.
5 minutes.
On more terrestrial ground and connecting in a metaphorical sense to this primitive soup, one of the projects developed at Tétis is entitled the Café de la Marine, a mobile cafe installation that aims to combine visual maritime imaginary with culinary narratives. And previous iterations have included a ghost ship cafe at Kulturfolge in Zurich in 2021, and an oracle soup as part of the festival Ebb and Flow, curated by Giulia Bussetti in Hamburg in June 2022. So maybe a primitive soup maritime cafe might also be in order at some point, at some juncture in the future. In Les couleurs de l'eau, Michel Butor invites us on the seashores. Les algues de la marée pénètrent parmi les dunes, les ombrelles de nuages sur la soie des orangers, les bancs d'huîtres et d'oursins, les défilés de dorades, la torpeur d'huile et de sable, l'arrivée des ouragans, rafales de sel et d'encre, céramique déchaînée. In The Human Shore, Sea Coast in History, John Gillis underlines that sea and oceanic coastal spaces have long been privileged spaces of human settlement, ideal for dual sea-land foraging. Yet, as the Ocean Space Ocean Symposium questions, do we really listen to the depth of the seas? In Ursula Biermann's video piece, Acoustic Oceans, a Sami biologist diver unpacks her equipment on the shores of northern Norway to probe and hear the voices of the sea and potentially to communicate with the creatures below. We had the chance of including in our series of artist text, Maritime Poetics, that we edited with Caroline Widmer, an extract from Ursula Biermann's text. This is script, rather, and which is accessible on open access and transcript if you want to have a look. But I end now with the notion of devolution, if applied to oceanic and planetary entities, suggests an invitation to divert from industrial overflows. An aquatic devolution is the rallying theme of tomorrow's dinner, organized by Maya Minder in collaboration with Tétis Group, represented by Anne-Laure Franchette and myself, together with Mathieu-Philippe Delisle, providing sound counterpoints to a culinary narrative that aims to explore the tension briefly sketched here between increasing spatial hubris and the ongoing invitation of exploring persistent aquatic unknowns. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for coming in on time there, Gabriel, and let's hope we can keep this up. Any quick sort of illuminations needed to Gabriel's talk? I mean, I have one. I mean, I went to see also the Charles Lim project about, because his work, after he did that, extended into the whole body of economics and this sale of sand, that you know, and setting up literally the amount of sand being bought by Singapore from other countries and being shifted in vast land reclamation. Did you want to comment on that project a bit?
Well, I was trying to say it's a multi-sided project. It's very ambitious and wonderful project work, but I would say it has, yes, both the negative, which I use, but both this negative and positive side to side. So it's certainly a question of infrastructure, this huge question of sand imports, which Singapore imports from many parts of the world, is indeed present in this work, as well as the conflicted interest. So the sea capital is very much present in this work. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Okay. Okay, so I'd like to introduce Maya Minder, who's the next up. If you'd like to come to the stage. So Maya's paper today is going to read it all, actually, because it's actually quite a provocative title in many ways. The Green Open Food Evolution, Dietetics and Endosymbiotic Co-Evolution to Become Homo Photosyntheticus. And I think what struck me about reading about your work, Maya, as well as seeing, of course, your extraordinary culinary performances, of which I believe you're doing one at a secret location this week, I'd like to comment, really. Well, also you're going to read your paper, but I was really interested in this notion of the evolution of the body through generations of diet that you talk about, the seaweed-eating people, and the fact that this whole notion of the evolution of the body could be similar to the evolution of these algae that becomes self-perpetuating. And it reminds me a bit of like this whole notion that was popular about 10 years ago of living on air. I mean, this whole idea that the body itself can change its method of consumption of nutrients seems to be at the fundamental base of your work. So, I'd like you to talk also, you say here, cooking thus transforms us. So that transformational process very much is very interesting and inspiring. So I hope you're going to talk a bit about that in your paper. So over to you, Maya.
Thank you very much, Rob. Thank you very much to the organization from More Than Planet Symposium and to be hosted here at the Délégation Valentin. Again, my name is Maya Minder. I will present you Green Open Food Evolution, also the project Mikkel Mikkel. It means slippery or slimy as well, and it's all about eating seaweed and how to transform, as Rob so beautifully put it into words. Yes. So I'm an artist. I usually started with the practice of fermentation. I call myself fermentista. I also consider myself as an ecofeminist, working in the collective of Bad Lab, looking at biologic wisdom and social transformation. Biohacking is the approach that I received via the Bacteria Society that some of you maybe know. Sometimes I do curation, and mainly I love to collaborate with other artists, like with Teti Group this time, and also having the slogan that I'm pickling with friends for long-time preservation. So not only deaf friends, but with friends as well.
Maya, could you hold the mic a bit closer?
Yes,
That's better.
That's better.
It's
okay.
a large space, yeah.
So some of the people I collaborated so far, and also some of the books that I'm very much inspired. Of course, there is the queer feminist approach where Anna Zink-Löwenhaupt or Donna Haraway is part of it. Like the introduction to Lynn Margulis has been a mind-opening for me, which I not learned through Haraway, but through the practice of fermentation. So I always had this do-it-yourself approach. I learned fermentation myself. I digged into it also with the biographical roots that I had. So I've been fed kimchi since before I could even think. And I started in my art practice also to put the heroines in the center of a table as well. So not to speak of the humans, it's this human-centered view of it, but using the microbes and yeast and fungi that come from fermentation practices and agriculture as well. This has been a project that I worked with Marc Dussier together at the Food Culture Days in Vevey, which was a workshop on comparing cheese making to CRISPR-Cas9 technology, where we took reference to the CRISPR kit from the Odin and tried to show people how easy biotechnology also could be, and how all this biotechnological wisdom that humanity has been applying since 10,000 years within the practice of fermentation. This has been a project in collaboration with Philip Rothman, a PhD student at the NCCR MSc, which is a research project on molecular system engineerings. He there approached me myself, not me him, that he was also working with the agent of lactobacillus, but in form of a GFP, and proposed to create this hybrid where we induced the GFP into the kimchi that we made. So we really succeeded to produce GFP kimchi, but by first using a lot of antibiotics, and of course we did not eat it. But the interesting point was that after 2 weeks, it didn't glue anymore, bioluminescent. So meaning that the wild strains of the lactobacillus, they still survived the antibiotics and overgrown the GFPs as well. I'm also a performance artist. This was a performance in 5 chapters called Botany of Desire, which was much inspired by the author and journalist Michael Pollan, who is mainly also famous because of his book, The Omniverse Dilemma. So talking about food and food commodity and the history that human has entangled with their domesticated plants as well. So Green Open Food Evolution has been a research project that I started 2 years ago by the invitation of Avon Chardonnay, and then also becoming a project together with Avon Chardonnay, where I look at this approach of what seaweed has a role in on a planetary scale. We created this installation in 2022 with architects from Britannia and kind of calling it also a media kitchen, which can be activated by different performances. It is CNC carved wood, using a lot of mixed media, biomaterials, and kitchen tools that can be used as well for cooking, but also performing and presenting. So the role of a media kitchen in Green Open Food Evolution questions how biohacking can take into consideration the approach to evolutionary biology produced by Lynn Margulis, molecular transformation during the cooking process, and cross-disciplinary approaches using new media, performance, and life itself to activate the architectural structure. Cooking thus transforms us is the starting point of my practice and has a holistic approach for transformation and progression, informed by the many interconnections between food and the act of eating, an approach that mutually fosters care and creates new forms of symbolisms, alchemy, and storytelling. So maybe some of you remember this picture and also the pin that Stuart Brand was distributing to everybody back in the 70s, asking why haven't we seen a picture of the whole Earth yet? Now in the 21st century, arriving into 21st century, we have this picture also of the blue marble, but on top of it you see a triclone. So climate change has been impacting humanity and the planetary system, the Earth system, and this has become mostly obvious also by satellite monitoring and the possibility that we can create imagery on how the global scale of climate is also affecting Earth. Food, for sure, is one of the sectors that causes some of the most carbon dioxide footprints and impacts on our system. Here you see the European greenhouse in Madeira, Spain, in the south of Spain, where most of our vegetable in Central Europe is originally from. So with the change of that was evoked by the green, so-called green revolution in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, also the scale of agriculture has changed. To an impact that nowadays there's only few who are producing the fertilizer, the pesticides, and the seed production. And this is also using most 65% of the land that then becomes distributed to global human population. So the way that we are eating has been changed drastically within only 60 to 80 years. Those are some pictures taken from the Roscosmos satellites, showing irrigated agriculture from space, as well as another picture of the green blue algae blooms that so often has slowly started to infiltrate our media as well, and people slowly become aware that algae also can become a threat towards humanity. Yuval Harari wrote in his book *Sapiens: A Brief History of Human Mankind* that in absolute numbers it's not actually humans that are dominating the planet Earth, but it is the cows, the pigs, and the chickens. So to say, it's 44 billion chickens, 24 billion cows, and estimated pigs, and estimated 40 billion cows, who are changing also the surface of our planet Earth. So seaweed has been a very long underestimated food source, nowadays also called a superfood that can provide a lot of alternative as a protein resource, but also as a source of omega-3 fats, which normally is only inhibiting fish consumption, and also devotes a lot of minerals that are essential to human growth. Seaweed is also used in the cosmetic industry and is promising a lot of potential of beautifying, stress protection, anti-aging, antioxidant, immune booster, sunscreen, masking odors, colors, and free radical collectors. Seaweed and algae is also used in biomedicine, where scientists start to research, especially after the COVID times, to research about if it is possible to integrate cyanobacteria and microalgae into plasters or materials that then can be used to produce oxygen and energy. And seaweed as a food commodity has been also used widely and distributed by eating seaweed inside sushi, but mainly Japanese and Asian culture has been integrating it since a very ancient time. It is still considered as a cheap food source, but also as a unfamiliar, for Western tongues, unfamiliar and unknown food source. Seaweed as biofuel is, in the many words of scientists, where they see a great potential of replacing carbon-based energy sources with microorganisms such as algae, because they can contain more than 80% of oil inside them. And even in space exploration, the so-called superfood spirulina has been used as a closed system to provide astronauts not only by food, but also as a cleaning water system and producing oxygen. So actually, those algae blooms, they are as well visible by space, creating these beautiful meandering pictures, and has been possible to be detected because satellites do monitor the chlorophyll extractions of the oceans. They found out that chlorophyll actually is, the phytoplankton, the seaweeds, actually are producing more than 50% of the oxygen on a planetary atmosphere. And this has been already proven and tested by the scientist James Lovelock within the Gaia hypothesis from the 70s, where Gaia hypothesis in the 70s was somehow also criticized, I guess mainly by the name itself, but also, and one of the main factors was that the empiric data to prove Gaia hypothesis as a very complex hypothesis was not as easy to prove it. So now arriving in 21st century, I believe that even in a societal level, like people start to realize that Earth is also a closed entropy and that everything can be connected and is connected and has a reverb effect as well on it. Lynn Margulis, of course, was the woman who gave the biochemical aspects behind the hypothesis. And besides that, she's also known for the theory of the endosymbiosis, where she says that as a counterposition to evolutionary theories by neo-Darwinists of claiming that the survival of the fittest would claim the chain of evolution, she said there is also the idea of the symbiosis, that instead of fighting each other is also creating synergies together with each other by eating by himself each other but not digesting each other. So science nowadays is able to show the tiniest nucleus and make depictions and visualizations of this microcosmos of what life should be. But life itself has become obsolete, and we still continuously ask what life itself is. The Chinese proverb itself says, everything is born, everything grows, everything is aging, and everything is dying as well. Life is a circle, and it's a perpetual circle of transforming material into different states of energies. So considering the bacteria, which are also the oldest living organisms on planet Earth, as superior, and taking away this anthropocentric view of planet Earth, we also realize that bacteria are the ones who are able to communicate without having borders in between the different living unities. The idea of the holobiome, the lateral gene transfer, and the new research on the microbiome shows as well that there is a different and a new perception of what life is and how everything is tangled together more and more as a present realm. So when we think of the laterality of evolution, and that not only the man stands on top of the text on the evolutionary chain, then we slowly maybe also start to consider what happens if we shift our notion about dominance, coevolution, predominance, and hierarchical numbers. What if we change the subject-object relationship? So through food, as I said, there is a connection, and scientists also starting to prove this. There has been also this article published about the sushi factor, that the Japanese microbiome has been changing within the century-long intake of seaweeds as well. Taking this paper as consideration, and also this old tradition of, ancient old tradition of eating seaweeds, I wanted to start and dig into this culture of how to eat more seaweed and incorporate this also into a Western diet. In Japan, seaweeds slowly also, or even gets sent into space as a nostalgic food for the astronauts that would miss planetary Earth. And with Mikkel, there's this projection of when the life cycle has become so complex and we still don't really understand what life is, maybe there's evolutionary also a possibility of us becoming green and turning into some kind of a living unity that is morphing into a symbiotic existence that can uptake sun as a pure form of energy and then only enjoy food as a recreation and pleasure activity. So when to say that the seaweeds itself has a very complex life system, seaweeds are not even considered as a plant. They are part of the proticist kingdoms. This kingdom that Ling Margulis says, it's a very much underestimated kingdom, and so much research has still to be done, and most of the living entities are coming out of the ocean. There are already existing symbionts that are using both the animal kingdom as well as also a plant kingdom, and somehow are not integer into putting into just one card box. The worm of the Roscoffensis, of course, is this famous example where in his larvae stadium he eats the most amount of microalgae to then, in one moment, not digest it anymore, but incorporates it into his skin and stops eating in this moment. So the question is, like, when we have all those different types of seaweeds, the micro and the macro, and they are also present all around the world on borders between land and oceans. What if we could also change ourselves and incorporate this more in our food cultures as well? So for our Japan dissemination that we did just in April, I created a homepage as well. This homepage was a request for Japanese people to donate new recipes on seaweed. And the homepage I have on a tablet here, I will show it you as well in a later moment. And that's the wrong one. And it's much inspired by 90s internet hypertext coding. So the homepage is built in a way that it's also a game, that you can choose what kind of answers you want to take. And has many different paths to go through it. So it also asks people if they think that the ritual of home cooking is also contributing to the way how we perceive the world and contributing against climate change. It takes a bit of time to load it. And at the end, you can also look at it yourself. Yes. That's it. Thank you very much.
That's great, because that gives us a chance for a little bit more discussion, as you've ended nicely on time there. I forgot to mention in the intro that you're also co-curator of the recent soil assembly, which Gabriel and the TETI group were part of. Can you say something about that?
Yes, the soil assembly. The soil assembly was held in January during the Kochi Musiri Biennale and was a collaboration with Westminster University, Neil White, with Rob Lafranès, then Makery, Ewan Chardonnay, and Meena Vari from Srishti School of Art, Design and Technology in Bangalore. And the initiative was the idea that around the globe we see more and more practices of people and art communities, art schools that incorporate agriculture, permaculture, living pedagogies, and circularity into their curriculum of teaching as well. And we wanted to create this platform to give a voice as a unified voice, also to have a platform where people can network and meet together, and putting a strong emphasis also on the words of an assembly, which is, I guess, inspired as well on the assembly meetings from a non-aligned movement as well.
Great. Anyone got any urgent questions from the floor for Maya? Because one of the things, of course, this afternoon, we're moving into more and more algae and more lovelock and Gaia, and I think that will be related by the next speaker. But in the meantime, thank you very much, Maya. That was a great presentation. Thank you. And his talk is going to be called, I say paper because there's a lot of papers going on over there at ISEA, but these are talks, I hope, rather than papers. A history of the Gaia hypothesis through algae. And so you've really become, you, Sebastian, have become the kind of Lovelock and Margolis expert in that you've brought out a book about the letters between them. And in our discussion earlier, I was kind of interested in knowing whether their discussions about Gaia and algae and all those things kind of connected with the planetary climate emergency, and Lovelock being particularly known for advocating geoengineering. And you commented a bit on the fact that actually this seemed to be a subject that wasn't discussed between Margulis and Lovelock. Anyway, you are working on the links between these scientific representations of the Earth and climatology and philosophies and policies of nature, including geoengineering and planetary limits. So let's take it away with more Lovelock and Margulis and lots more algae.
So, thank you very much. I'm really grateful for the invitation and happy to be here with you today. So I'll start right away with the talk. So the Gaia hypothesis was proposed by Lovelock and Margulis in the 60s and 70s. They start with two basic facts. First, life has a massive influence on its global environment. And second, the global environment has remained stable or habitable for more than 3 billion years in spite of external perturbations such as the increase of solar luminosity. And taken together, this fact led them to suggest the hypothesis that it is life which regulates the chemical and climatic environment of the Earth and accounted for by the maintenance of habitability. The importance of the idea of a regulation then led Lovelock to compare Gaia or the Earth with an organism. It was famously criticized by the evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins, arguing that Gaia raised issue and theoretical issues with natural selection. And after Dawkins' critique, there was a standard account of the Gaia hypothesis which pervaded the literature. This account states that the hypothesis has been dismissed by scientists after Doolittle and Dawkins' critics, that if there was a controversy, then the controversy was with evolutionary biologists, and that Gaia only attracted marginal New Agers. So this was the account that was the most influent about the Gaia hypothesis. Another account was proposed by Lovelock himself. So the way Lovelock proposed the history of the Gaia hypothesis is as followed. He said that Gaia originated when he was working for the NASA and reflecting about how to detect life on other planets. And after these reflections, Lovelock said that he retired as an independent scientist in the countryside in the southwest of England. This idea of independent scientist, he takes it very seriously. It's the title of his autobiography and of many of his articles. And his autobiography starts with the following sentences. I want to tell you in this book why I buried myself in the country village of Boverchalk. And this is the way he framed the history of the Gaia hypothesis. And he also proposed the idea that Gaia was not just a hypothesis, but was also a research program which was to change the earth and life sciences, and also a new philosophy of nature alternative to modernities. So this talk, I'll try to challenge both of these accounts, the one of the biologist and the one of Lovelock himself. So I'll start with a few historical elements on the elaboration of the Gaia hypothesis. So Lynn Margulis was a field microbiologist, so she spent her whole career collecting and observing microbes under microscopes. So I won't go through her story of symbiosis, as Maya already recalled this story. Lovelock was trained as a chemist with a strong empirical bent. He spent 20 years in a biomedical institute where he worked on the transmission of colds and the way to practice disinfection. He worked on biochemistry and diseases, and in cryobiology, basically froze a hamster and try to bring them back to life. After this work in biomedicines, he moved to measures in atmospheric chemistry. When the small village of Boverchalk was too crowded with visitors, he would go to Ireland in a holiday cottage. And this is an extract from his autobiography. He said, the coast was a place rich in varieties of large algae or seaweed. I would wander with the book, identifying the many species that were there, because I had a gas chromatograph in the cottage, I could collect the different species of algae in jam jars and analyze the volatile compounds they emitted. This measure led him to embark on a vessel to conduct measure of chemical measurements of atmospheric chemistry. There, he made the first measures of CFCs, which were later on discovered to be responsible for the ozone hole. And he also showed that the dimethyl sulfide, which is emitted by phytoplankton, enables to close the global sulfur cycle. So Lovelock and Margulis collaborated in the 70s, and afterward their paths shift in different directions. The idea that Gaia is alive can be understood in two very, very different ways. So the first important point is that Gaia was not only the name of a hypothesis, it was first and foremost the name of a new entity, namely the entity constituted by the total ensemble of all living beings and the environment with which they interact. And the idea that this entity is alive has most commonly been understood along the way of an analogy. Basically, the idea was that the Earth regulates itself just as organisms or thermostats do. So if the Earth is alive, it is because it behaves just like an organism. There's another reading which is possible and which is very different, it's to understand what I called a vital extension argument. I think the most pedagogical proposition of this argument has been made by Scott Turner, a physiologist of termites. And Turner said that if you try to understand the metabolic activities of termites, then you will realize that their localization in space does not stop at their epidermis or cuticles. It goes all the way through the termite ponds because the termites build the termite mounds and their metabolic activities build this environment, which is in fact not an environment, but a part of the termites themselves. And it is precisely in this way that Lovelock and Margulis understood that the atmosphere was alive. Lovelock said that the atmosphere or the ocean can be seen as a component part of the biosphere rather than a mere environment for life, just like the fur of a mink or the shell of a snail. So I'll now go through Gaia's perception. So there was a small scientific literature and a vast cultural appropriation of Gaia in the 80s and later on. So contrary to what biologists say about the Gaia hypothesis, there was a scientific discussion of the hypothesis. It is constituted by roughly 200 articles, a few books, and several major conferences entertained by a handful of people, mostly based in the UK. In the 80s, there were three major scientific articles published on the way the erosion of rocks the way the erosion of rocks influenced by living beings may enhance Earth's habitability, the influence of dimethyl sulfide on climate, and Daisy World, an abstract mathematical model. So after having shown that the DMS emitted by algae can close the sulfur cycle, Lovelock suggested with other colleagues that this compound may in fact regulate the climate since the dimethyl sulfide is important for the nucleation of cloud. And there was the suggestion of a feedback loop which may lead to climate regulation through these processes. Cyanobacteria are often mentioned to be responsible for producing all of atmospheric oxygen and also for producing the stratospheric ozone. It was later on suggested that the oxygenation event was also responsible for the first ecological crisis and the first major glaciation, which were called snowballers. And another interesting, although less often discussed fact about the consequences of oxygen in the atmosphere is that it may also be responsible for the maintenance of plate tectonics, which would link three different singularities of the Earth in the solar system, the presence of liquid water, of life, and of plate tectonics. The important point about this small scientific literature discussing the Gaia hypothesis is twofold. First, it's very important if you compare this to the narrative made by the biologists, but it is very small or ridicule if you compare the size of this literature with Lovelock's claim of a grandiose scientific revolution. In other words, there was a taboo about the word Gaia in the scientific literature. Scientists were very much willing to discuss mechanisms linking DMS with the regulation of climate or the erosion of rocks and the maintenance of habitability, but they refuse to cite the word Gaia. In the same time, there was a very wide cultural appropriation of Gaia as a philosophy of nature. Very different traditions, neo-paganism, New Age scientists, nature and ethics spirituality, theologians, ecofeminists, philosophical anthropologists, political ecology in the UK or the American counterculture, all took the Gaia hypothesis as a new philosophy of nature. And beyond the very important differences between these traditions, what unites them is that they saw Gaia as a philosophy of nature alternative to modernity. Basically, the idea that if the mechanicization of the cosmos is the origin of all the problematic aspects of modernity's cosmology, the divide between nature and culture, between in and out, the exploitation of woman and nature, the desacralization or disenchantment of the world or nature, reductionism and an epistemological regime of separation, then Gaia, by saying that the Earth is in fact alive, put in discussion or intention all these deep issues. And the point I wanted to make about the cultural appropriation of Gaia is that it's not marginal, as biologists say, but it is massive and it is inseparable from the scientific history itself. So I now turn to the impact Gaia has in the sciences broadly construed. Lovelock and Margulis did not want to contribute to evolutionary biology, but to change the earth and life sciences. So what is the reception in the earth sciences beyond the small scientific literature which I just mentioned? And the point I will make in this section is that Gaia's conception of the earth has pervaded contemporary earth sciences, even though the word Gaia is not pronounced. So if you want to understand the effect that Gaia had, you have to have a basic idea of the way earth scientists conceive their object of study, that is, the way they conceive the earth as an object. So this is a schematic draft of various important conceptions of the earth and the way they imagined the second part of the 20th century. I'll just give you a few examples just to have an idea of the contrast between different conceptions of the earth which Gaia opposed. So I'll start with geophysics. Very important work by scholars in history and sociology of science have shown that geophysics arose during the Cold War. So many important disciplines emerged or get really stronger during this period because they had military implications. So meteorology and climatology, physical oceanography and seismology were very important disciplines if you want to trace back the origin of nuclear tests. Similarly, meteorology was a very important discipline if you want to plan the flights of planes. And in the oceanographic sciences, the study of temperature profiles and the mapping of the magnetic properties of the ocean floors were very important for the circulation of submarines. And okay, so I'm fine. It was also during this period that a new practice or a new style, a new way of doing science emerged with the first numeric simulation. And at the time, numeric simulations, when the first electronic computer was built, were used to solve the equations of fluid mechanics, which were important for climatology and also to elaborate a thermonuclear bomb. During this period, so geophysics constituted as a discipline and led rise to the two major paradigms in the earth sciences nowadays, namely climatology and plate tectonics. And in climatology and in plate tectonics, the Earth is conceived as a physical system. Here you can see a representation of what was called the climatic system in the 70s, where the author tried to depict all the variables which one has to study if one wants to understand the climate. And if you look carefully at these variables, you will realize that they are all variable from physics, so mostly from thermodynamics and fluid mechanics. And it is the same thing for plate tectonics. Plate tectonics are defined given mechanical and thermal properties. So in other words, living beings were completely absent from this conception, from this physical conception of the Earth. This has been shown by many authors, including Naomi Oreskes in his important book, Science on a Mission, which tries to understand the way the Cold War has shaped the ocean sciences. And in this book, she quotes oceanographers saying, meteorologists don't study birds, so why should oceanographers study fish? Another conception of the Earth which developed roughly at the same time as geophysics was geochemistry. I'll be briefer here and I'll just show you a standard image of the way geochemists conceived their object of study in the 60s. They compared the Earth to a vast chemical industry with all the parts of the Earth being divided as reservoirs of chemical matters with fluxes and exchanges between these reservoirs. So in order to understand Gaia, one has to realize that it was a conception of the Earth which was proposed as an alternative to this physical and chemical conception of the Earth entirely devoid of life. And in the following minutes, I'll try to show you that even though the word was not pronounced, Gaia is still influential on nowadays conception of the Earth. So I think the most telling example is that of the 2-degree target. You certainly have all heard about this target. It was famously theorized by Hans-Joachim Schellnhuber, a leading theoretician in Earth system science. So he theorized this idea in the 90s, and the way it justifies this objective is with the following words. He says 2 degrees may not be a lot if one compares the temperature inside a room and outside a room, but if you compare this rise of temperature to the functioning, to a fever of an organism, then you will realize that a small increase of temperature can lead to a catastrophic failure of certain organs of the body, and it can do exactly the same at the scale of the Earth. And this conception of the Earth with an organism, Schellnhuber directly took it from Lovelock, although I don't have to show it in detail. I don't have the time to show it in detail. And Schellnhuber was very influential. He was the leading climate scientist in Germany. He also was the scientist advising the Pope for his Laudato Si encyclic. Another example of Gaia's influence, this is one of the most important geoengineering reports published by the Royal Society in 2009. And on the cover of this report, you can see the daisies of the Daisy World model published by Lovelock and Watson. And in fact, in the report, there is no mention of Daisy World, no mention of Lovelock, no mention of Gaia, but just tacit reference on the cover. And in 2006, Lovelock received one of the most prestigious medals from the Geological Society of London for having initiated a new field in the earth sciences, namely earth system science. So earth system science presents themselves as the sciences studying the interaction between the atmosphere, the water, the ocean, the earth, and life. This discipline started with a massive scientific and institutional effervescence in the 80s under the label global change. The global change took the meaning it has today in the 80s, along with the publication of this report all about global change. So various scientists, climatologists, oceanographers, geochemists, ecologists from all over the world went arguing to the institutions structuring and funding the sciences that an entirely new earth science was needed. This science has to be interdisciplinary and international, has to study the global changes which affected the earth as a system. And there were two arguments for the importance of a new science. First, the scientific emergency of global changes, and second, the fact that earth scientists just recognized a new object of study, the earth system. The major outcome of this institutional effervescence in the 80s were first an institutional reorganization of the earth sciences at the time when the earth sciences became environmental sciences along with ecology. And the second major outcome was the production of normative concepts articulating knowledge and politics of the earth. So in other words, a central outcome of earth system science is not so much the production of new data, of new models, but it is the production of new concepts which have reached the great public. And they took the idea to reflect on new concepts, on new way to think about the earth very seriously. This is the word from Will Stephen, which was leading the major institution of earth system science in 1998. What is the nature of Earth? The challenge for IGBP over the next 3 years is to make significant contribution towards answering this question. And it is in this institution that the word Anthropocene was first coined by Paul Crutzen, and also in this institution that the idea of planetary boundaries or of tipping elements were produced by a handful of Earth system theoreticians. And here you can see a picture from a famous article from Hans-Joachim Schellnhuber, who was the leading Earth system theoretician I mentioned, where he presents the Earth as a living and interconnected system, even though it does not mention the word Gaia. So the point is that Gaia profoundly changed the earth sciences and influenced contemporary conceptions of the Earth. But why was the word Gaia taboo in these sciences? A famous answer is that it was taboo because of the so-called New Age reception of Gaia, but I think there was a second and perhaps more important reason, especially for the earth and environmental scientists. So in order to understand this reason, we have to go back to Lovelock's biographical trajectory. So Lovelock was a talented chemist and engineer, and he was in the late 50s working in the temple of gas chromatography in England. And it is in this period that he invented the electron capture detector, a famous device which enabled massive jump in analytical chemistry. It enabled to increase the sensibility of instruments by 1,000-fold at the time. And it is for this talent as an engineer that he was invited by NASA not to propose philosophical or theoretical reflections about the nature of life. So he had to work on instruments which were to be sent on Mars or on the Moon. So I will now try to show you that Lovelock was not so much an independent scientist, but a scientific entrepreneur. There is an important book by the historian of science, Stephen Shapin, called The Scientific Life, where Shapin tries to understand what it means to be a scientist at different times of history, going from the solitary and exceptional genius whose vocation is inspired by God in the 17th and 18th century to the idea of an ordinary person employed by the state and contributing to a collective expert enterprise in the 20th century. And in the 70s, there's a new category which emerged, which is that of scientific entrepreneur, namely mostly scientists working in biotech startup and having a foot in universities and another in private companies. And to a vast extent, Lovelock corresponds to the status of scientific entrepreneur. The invention of his device enabled him to work as a consultant at the same time for the major institution of the earth and environmental sciences documenting global changes. The NCAR, which is the Temple of Climatology in the US, the NOAA, which structures ocean and oceanographic sciences in the US, the Met Office in the UK, the NERC, which structures the sciences of the environment in the UK. And at the very same time, he's also working for private companies, mostly chemical and petroleum ones, such as Shell, DuPont, Imperial Chemical Industries, or lobbies such as the American Chemistry Council. If you want to understand what Lovelock was doing precisely at the time Gaia was elaborated, you can understand him as an expert in global pollution. If you think about any issue which is classically said to have accompanied the emergence of the rise of global environmental consciousness, the DDT denounced by Rachel Carson in Silent Spring, the CFC and the ozone war in the 70s, the controversy over lead in gasoline, urban smog, climate change, acid rains, or the circulation of atmospheric masses. Lovelock was working on all these subjects at the same time in the 60s and 70s. And the first written formulation of what was to be known as the Gaia hypothesis is not a scientific article, but it is a prospective note written for Shell in 1966. So in other words, one can read Lovelock's first book as a scientific and philosophical reflection on Earth life and nature, but also as an anthropological reflection on the concept of global pollution. So in other words, if you want to understand what is Gaia, it is not so much an avatar of altruistic conceptions of nature, putting forward cooperation and mutual aid against competition between individuals, as biologists understood it. It is not so much a philosophy of life elaborated by an independent scientist, as Lovelock put it, but it is also a new conception of the Earth to think about global pollution, which emerged in the 70s, elaborated by a scientific entrepreneur. And the reason why scientists were wary with Gaia were not so much issues about the fact that Gaia was not a testable hypothesis or because there was an issue with natural selection. It was because of Lovelock's political prescriptions. On many of the issues I mentioned, Lovelock had position very similar to the Merchant of Doubt denounced by Naomi Waskes and Eric Conway. He argued frequently that on many issues, especially in the ozone affair, we have time to regulate and we should not panic over the irrational fear of cancer entertained by the Greens. And Lovelock is also famous and controversial for having proposed a geoengineering scheme, and the most recent one is the idea to put giant ocean pipes to stimulate the growth of phytoplankton and algae so as to pump carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So in this talk, I tried to present you a new narrative about Gaia, different from the biologists and different from Lovelock, where the controversy is centered much more on Lovelock's political prescription than on testability or other scientific issues. Lovelock is a scientific entrepreneur and not a New Age guru or an independent scientist, as it has been presented, and where Gaia's origin is to be found not so much within NASA's reflection on the detection of life, but on Lovelock reflections on global pollution. So thank you very much for your attention.
So I'm going to call up Gabrielle and Maya. While you're coming to the stage, I just want to ask you, to probe you even further. I know you're a historian of the Gaia hypothesis, but this alarming fact, or this alarming idea of Lovelock's at the end to stimulate the growth of algae. Yes, please sit. Thank you. To stimulate the growth of algae through this geoengineering. I mean, I've written about and been in discussion with Professor Bill McGuire at UCL, who is basically has made his study that of geoengineering. He's talking mainly about cloud seeding, and he wrote a novel in which there was a major geoengineering project that actually led to a new ice age on Earth because it went too far. So are you in a position to comment on the safety of Lovelock's proposal? Can you comment on that?
Yes, I can. In fact, when I did my undergrad in the earth sciences, I wanted to work on Gaia already, and I asked for an internship. And Lovelock just proposed this idea, it was in 2007 or 2008. And I worked with an oceanographer, the modelers, and we use oceanographic models to test the idea. I mean, what would happen if one would mix the surface layers of the ocean? And in fact, it doesn't work because it brings dissolved CO2 in the ocean back into the atmosphere. It also brings nutrient, which was the original plan of Lovelock, but the effect, the sort of effect is negative, is at the opposite direction at what Lovelock envisaged, because the nutrient had a small effect, but the pump and the mixing brings more greenhouse gases than it pumps ultimately. I don't know if I'm clear, but actually it doesn't work.
So can it be regulated?
What?
This growth of algae?
And it cannot be regulated. I mean, there has been several schemes. The most famous scheme, geoengineering scheme to enhance algae productivity is to dump iron in oceanic regions where there is not enough iron for phytoplankton growth. And it's the same thing. It's short term because rapidly the iron will sink in the depths of the ocean and the bloom of algae will disappear. So basically the short answer is that these ideas don't work that much.
Okay, thanks. I mean, this is an open forum, but I mean, I can't help adding that these geoengineering solutions are often supported by the polluting industries and the fossil fuel industries to say, well, you know, we can carry on drilling, we can carry on burning up because there's a scientific answer around the corner. So anyway, I'll just put that in. Is Karine, are you going to go around with a mic? Right, okay, so this is a free event, but what is not free is your intellectual input. So we need you now to contribute, all of you, to the debate. No holding back, please. So could we have questions for the panel from the audience, please? I think someone's going to have to kick off. Marco's smiling. Marco Pelham.
This one works. Yeah, I have a question regarding Lovelock because I was reminded, of course, of Vernadsky and his Biosphere, a book from 1925. And Lovelock very controversially does not somehow connect to Vernadsky's Biosphere, which was described as a chemobiogeological system, yeah, of the Earth. So very close to Lovelock's description. And I'm just curious if you have come across in your research about, you know, about this controversy, because of course, when you list the influences and the way the Earth system science is developed, it's somehow impossible to not talk about Vernadsky in this context, because this was the first time that everything kind of came together.
Does it work? Yes. So thank you for the question. Yes, I did have work on this issue. My position is the following. So in the scientific history, I think Vernadsky didn't have that much influence on. It didn't have any influence on Gaia since it was first translated in English in the 80s, and it was before that time. It was basically not known by the scientists involved in the global change effervescence.
It was translated into French in 1929.
Yes, but that's true. But I think Vernadsky had a very profound influence on the cultural appropriation, which I mentioned, through Teilhard de Chardin mostly. But it was barely known by scientists. And I have one particular example which is striking for me, that Crutzen, so the Nobel Prize at the origin of the Anthropocene, the only time where he discussed Gaia critically is at the very time he published the idea of the Anthropocene in 2002. But Crutzen knew Lovelock and knew Gaia for decades because they were both involved in the ozone affair. And in this paper, Vernadsky said, you know, we didn't need Lovelock that much because we had Vernadsky as an important precursor. But if you look at the time Crutzen has cited Vernadsky, he has only cited him very recently after he was translated. And I think Crutzen and many others have used Vernadsky as a legitimate precursor because Lovelock was embarrassing with his political prescription. So I think my reading, I mean, I may be wrong, but from what I've read in the history of the reports, the way people cite others, read French or not, and so on and so forth, I think Vernadsky didn't have any influence before the 80s and before the important effervescence in the science part, but had an important influence on the cultural reception of Gaia, where people have long known that the Earth is alive.
Yeah. Didn't have any influence in Western science.
Yes, right. Yes, of course. Yeah, yes. I mean, I have colleagues
in Eastern Europe. He was quite well known.
Exactly. I have colleagues working on this on Eastern sciences, and I have not worked on this part, but the
Thank
story will
you.
be entirely different, that's true.
No, but I was curious because he was translated into French in 29, so we cannot say that there was no influence whatsoever. Maybe people didn't understand him. What? Margolis, yeah.
Yes, but it was very late. I mean, it was after it was translated. Margulis didn't know Vernadsky before it was translated in English. She participated to the translation and to the edition of the translation, but she didn't know Vernadsky before the 80s.
Yeah. Yeah, it's right to point out the Russians. Maybe we've got a speaker over there.
Maybe it's a seg to the question on Vernadsky. It seems to me that the three takes today on the oceanic tend to move towards relational conditions of life and the planetary. And my question is whether you could, each one of you could indicate more clearly in your mind what are the institutional impacts of the new relational conditions that you are describing. In particular, I'm thinking, as a segue to the question of Vernadsky, it's obvious that the connection is in the very complex modeling of the Earth that emerged in the post-war period that connect the Western to the Soviet Union, and at the center of that is the notion of a system. No? It's the entire notion of, in the West, it's cybernetics. In the East, it's a far more complex notion of relational. And I'm really interested in understanding from you how you see the institutional impact of your work.
Maya, would you like to take that? Yeah.
Yes, I was maybe I can go from the example of fermentation, that there is the studies of the microbiome. And I always say that, you know, you have this, the history of the genomics now that is also changing how we perceive life, right? Now we have DNA, everything can be analyzed into numbers, into codes. And within the studies of the microbiome, like I realize, like scientists also, they are approaching like a wall, which becomes very difficult and the studies become very complex as well. And you talk about metagenomics and I mean, the idea to analyze and write down the entire microbiome of all humanity, then you can go to all the animals and the ants and to all, just to cartograph and try to make sense, right, in a scientific way, right? But the most the most fascinating fact was like what scientists found out about the studies on the microbiome was, we actually don't know so much. We can just say that there are 3 different enterotypes in humanity, right? So there's only 3 different types of microbiomes, and each microbiome is very individual and hard to, like, it's hard to draw a comparison between humans as well. And those 3 enterotypes, this fact that they found out this 3 enterotype is something that traditional Chinese medicine and Ayurvedic has been discovered since 3,000 years, right? So I thought this is really fascinating that science tries to you know, peel the onion to the very essence of something, to see truth behind the smallest nucleus and tiniest thing, whether the ancient systems of knowledge production also had a different approach, which maybe can be, I don't know, more holistic, whatever, but comes to similar results at the end, right? So yeah, it changes the notions and science history, and it's interesting. Yeah.
And so the art and science symbiosis, that actually does bring that debate to the fore. You know, whether poetics are as important as that. That's very specific data. And would you see that as a difference between what we're calling Western science and Eastern science? Or other systems of science?
No, I wouldn't say Western and Eastern because, like with the Gott, for example, there are so many proverbs within the Volksmund, so, right? So the folkloric language, the old proverbs that mothers and grandfathers teach the kids, and they bear like a lot of knowledge inside, right? So I don't think it's only Western and Eastern divided, but it's more like what are the right? What are the indigenous people of Europe, the white ones, right?
Yeah, good way of describing it. More questions for all the panel, please. Come on. I'm sure someone must have been stimulated by those extraordinary conversations.
Or remark.
Or remarks, yeah. It doesn't have to be just questions. Please, one there.
I have just a tiny little remark to keep the conversation flowing for Gabriel. And I really appreciate the first film he showed from this German artist. I forgot the name, who made this performance on a...
Christoph Schwarz.
Yeah, and I think it's very interesting. This, I also really like the film of the artist Alan Sekula, the documentary film about the container ships. And because I live in Le Havre in France, and the other day I met a captain, actually, who is the captain of a container ship. And it's really amazing, actually, because you still, I thought it's a bit like an airplane. You just press a button and it goes by itself. But it's apparently still a super skill, and because there's so many millions of tons of fuel in there, that, depending on the atmosphere, you have to steer this boat so that you save petrol and all that. So, so apparently it's still very organic as a job. I don't know, but that was my comment to the...
Yeah, okay. I chose, Sekula is often the example that I choose in some of his examples. The beginning of the Forgotten Space has this, when he narrates the beginning of a narrative, you're sort of lost in between land and sea, and with, he evokes this movement of ships that are invisible to our eyes and therefore maybe forgotten to our attention, perhaps, sort of echoing the question that was raised earlier. So that's, I think that since they were made at the same date, I found that it's quite interesting. And of course, Sekula was a very politically engaged artist and photographer. So yes, sort of and also alludes to a form of what I'd once called a sort of deserted navigation. But and we were in the soil assembly that's been mentioned. I was participating in a panel that was all about alternate modes of maritime food transportation. So looking at like kind of really activist type of trading, let's say. So yeah, this is certainly interesting. I would just say, I don't think the question of representation / action is quite interesting, of course, because the arts are often brought to as a sort of mediator to make causes and complex arguments visible to a wider public, and of course they can do that, and it's and they do it in many ways. But I think I also see a number of aesthetics that are more attuned to having a form of agency, and so who are maybe the relational that you were referring to, and whether that be on a single piece or through organization is a good question. Perhaps I would just say also shining a web, but I mean thinking of the idea of the way that a discursive proposal can re-influence metabolic, physical activity is one that was particularly argued for in urban political ecology, and by Erik Svingerdoef and people like that. And I think I'm very interested in that and concur that it's a good also, not alternate, but an addition to this just representative mode to something that actually has some form of agency. So.